In earlier videos, we've said a little bit about ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the ancient Hebrews, ancient Israel. Now we're going to begin to say some things involving ancient Greece. And mainly we're going to draw from classical Athens, and we're going to look at the thoughts of key figures from classical Athens. Socrates, one of our great model teachers, his student Plato, and then Plato's student Aristotle. These are three names that come to us from classical Athens. And then Sophocles, one of our great writers of plays. When we think about the ancient Hebrews, as we've said before, then one of the things we know is that the ancient Hebrews influence us every day whether we are aware of it or not, that the ancient Hebrews have left a tremendous legacy for people in Western civilization, Europe and the countries that came from Europe, but also for the entire world, really, as the influence of Western civilization goes around the world. And of course, the ancient Hebrews actually lived not in Europe, but in Asia, right, Western Asia. And so the Hebrews have had a tremendous global impact. The same thing is true of the Greeks. And the classical Greeks, the ancient Greeks, influence us every day, although we're often not aware of it. The scientific method, when we think of the specific approach to problems that we call science, a scientific approach to things, we see that for the first time among the Greeks. Drama, the plays of Sophocles, drama, we see that for the first time among the Greeks. History, as we think of it, that is, as a discipline where we gather facts, we do investigations, we gather documents, we have interviews, we gather information that's verifiable, and then we write a story about the past. And other people can read our story, they can look at our notes, they can look at the evidence we have, and they can determine whether or not the story that we've told about history fits the facts that have been gathered. That approach to history, of course, other ancient peoples have historical writings, but history as we think of it, written history as we think of it, comes to us for the first time from the Greeks. Logic, an emphasis on logic, that is systematic thinking. 1, 2, 3, therefore this. That's not to say that the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Hebrews were irrational. Of course they would employ what we would call logical thinking. Here we're talking about an emphasis, a Greek emphasis on logical thinking. Socrates would be a good example of this. So related to that would be systematic thinking, philosophy. In Hebrew writing, in other ancient writing, we find writing that is philosophical, ethical, moral, discussing life. But here again, we're talking about sort of an approach that's systematic. We see this with scientific thinking. We see this with the emphasis on logic. We see this with philosophy. Sort of a systematic walking through of ideas. An emphasis on excellence. It's not to say the ancient Hebrews, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians did not want to be excellent at certain things. I think this is a natural propensity, at least some humans have, to want to be excellent, but we see this really emphasized for the first time among the Greeks, and that's a theme that we'll get back to. Political theory. Again, in ancient literature, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Hebrews, you have information about politics, about governance, etc., but here again, we're talking about sort of the systematic approach to it, the step-by-step approach to it. We see this in Plato's Republic. We see this in Aristotle's book about politics. We see the beginnings of what we call democracy. Now, by our standards, democracy in ancient Greece isn't democracy. You have a lot of slaves. You have women who are not involved in public decision-making. So by the standards of the early 21st century, it doesn't really look like democracy. But the beginnings of democracy we see for the first time in classical Greece, or in ancient Greece. And then an emphasis on humanism. That is, things focused on human life, on human thought, on human action, on human aspiration. So an emphasis really on human beings. Right? Now, we want to be careful because, of course, Hebrew literature is full of stories about people and reflections on people, and we have the same thing in Mesopotamian and Egyptian literature. But here we're talking about kind of a focus on human action, sometimes without really much reference at all to the gods. So, for example, in Aristotle's Ethics, there are references to the gods, right? But it is really, primarily, most pages, it is a secular book, meaning it's a book very much about this world, about human action in this world, okay? Yes, it does refer to the gods, and yes, there is a connection in that book between human and divine action. But mostly, the book is about human action in this world, and so in that respect, it is humanistic, meaning the focus is on human beings, what they do, what they think, why they do what they do, why they think what they think. Now, so one of the topics we want to turn to as we look at some of the thoughts of a classical Greek writer, one of the things we want to look at is courage, right? And courage is defined here by the American Heritage Dictionary as a quality of mind that enables one to face danger with self-possession, confidence, and resolution. Now, I've added my own words, that star below, because if we think of facing danger, I think we think mainly of physical danger, but also psychological danger, personal danger, reputational danger, right? It might take courage to do something. You don't face any possible physical harm, but maybe you face the possibility of being ostracized. That is, people want to avoid you because you've taken a stand on something. That could be that could amount to a kind of psychological danger. Or if you take a certain stand on something, a courageous stand on something, and then people put labels on you, well then that presents a kind of reputational danger, right? So courage is a quality of mind that enables a person to face these various kinds of dangers with self-possession, that is, you keep control of yourself, confidence, and resolution. I'm going to stick with, where I'm going. I'm going to stay on this track. Synonyms for courage: bravery, valor, boldness, heroism. Antonyms: cowardice, timidity, weakness. Now, if we just look at the list real quick and say, well, which of these words would I like most to characterize me? I think most of us would pretty quickly say, well, I'd rather be brave than a coward. I'd rather be valorous than timid. I'd rather be bold than weak. So our word courage comes from the Latin word cor, for heart. You see that the French word cœur is still, very much like the Latin word. And then the Spanish word for heart, corazón, that first part, cor, comes right from the Latin. So a person of courage is a person of heart. A person of courage is a person who has a strong core, right? That sense of, a person who has a strong moral core, right? This is the kind of person that we're talking about. Now, when we think of courage, one of the most popular statements about it come to us from the Cowardly Lion. Unfortunately, a creature that lacks courage. But he makes a powerful statement about courage, even though it's a statement that actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What makes a king out of a slave? Courage. Well, that makes sense. What makes the flag on the mast to wave? Courage. Well, I'm not sure that sentence makes a whole lot of sense. Let's go down a few. What puts the ape in apricot? Courage. Oh, I'm not sure that makes a whole lot of sense. So you can stop the video and read this. What we'll actually do is let's watch this clip together. It's a lot of fun and it's inspiring, even though word for word it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Courage. What makes a king out of a slave? Courage. What makes the flag on the mast to wave? Courage. What makes the elephant charge his tusk in the misty mist or the dusky dusk? What makes the muskrat guard his musk? Courage. What makes the sphinx the seventh wonder? Courage. What makes the dawn come up like thunder? Courage. What makes the Hottentot so hot? What puts the ape in apricot? What have they got that I ain't got? Courage. You could say that again.
So right at the end there, the Cowardly Lion says, what do they got that I ain't got? And then Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow respond, courage. And, that's kind of sad, but as the movie goes on, things eventually work out for the Cowardly Lion. But we don't want to be like the Cowardly Lion. We don't want people to look at us and say, oh, you lack courage. Remember that list we saw, that list of words we saw a few screens back? We don't want people to look at us and think weak. We don't want people to look at us and think coward, right? We don't want people to look at us and say, timid. We want to be people of courage. And so it's something that's worth thinking about. And so when I think about this, when I think about a lot of these kinds of questions, one of the resources I turn to is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And the Nicomachean bit there, that's just someone's name, right? So we can just shorten this to Aristotle's Ethics, right? And Aristotle writes about courage. He writes about a lot of different topics. And one of the things Aristotle says that's very interesting is that courage involves a kind of fear. That the reason people act courageously is because they fear something. And one of the things he says is people act courageously because they fear disgrace. If I don't act courageously, then that will put me into some kind of, position of disgrace. Or perhaps I fear betrayal. If I don't take a stand for something, then that means I betray something that is important. I betray an ideal. I betray a country. I betray an institution. Therefore, I have to be courageous because I fear being seen as someone who betrayed something that was important. Knowingly letting unjustified harm come to other people. I don't want to get through this certain situation and look back and realize that I allowed other people to be harmed unjustifiably, right? I fear carrying the burden of that memory into the future. Therefore, that motivates me to want to be courageous. I think this is an interesting thought, that courage, one element of courage is a kind of fear of something else, something we want to avoid, right? The sense that I betrayed somebody, that I disgraced myself, that I let other people down, something like that. Aristotle notes that courage isn't rashness or recklessness. And so going out onto a freeway and running between cars and trying not to get hit, that's not courageous, that's crazy, that's reckless, right? And so we've got to make these distinctions, right? A courageous person, I think we can say, is going to be, in most cases, a wise person, a prudent person, a cautious person, not a reckless person, not a rash person. So it's really important to make these distinctions. Here's what Aristotle says. The courageous person will fear what is natural to fear. So we're not talking about an absence of fear, but will face it in the right way and as principle directs for the sake of what is right and honorable. Well, let's break that down a little bit. So a courageous person will fear what is natural to fear. Well, one of the things that comes to my mind is that we're talking about normal people then. We're not talking about Superman, we're not talking about Superwoman, we're talking about normal people who have the normal fears that come along in life. Fear of death, fear of not being part of the crowd, fear of ridicule, right? Normal people fear these sorts of things. Normal people, therefore, can be courageous. So they fear these things, but they will face them in the right way, right? In other words, some kind of, some situation comes up that requires a degree of courage. And if we have time, ahead of time to think about it, then that's what we do. We think about it. We deliberate. What should I do? How should I do it? What's the best approach to take? I know that I'm going to take a stand, some courageous stand. I fear that if I don't do that, then, I'll have to live with the memory of letting down some principle or something. So I need to do something, but how should I do it? In what way should I do it? All right? And then he says that people will, fear what's natural to fear, but they'll face that in the right way and as principle directs. So when we're talking about courageous people, we're talking about people who are motivated, animated by some principle. They have some ideals. They have some commitments. They have some beliefs. There are people in the world who don't really believe anything. I think we have people in the world who actually don't have any deep commitments. I think we have people in the world who don't really have any great ideals that they hold to. And I think Aristotle's idea is such people can't be courageous because Because courage is rooted in some principle. There are certain principles, and I'm willing to compromise in some ways. I want to get along, but there are certain principles that when it comes to it, I'll stand for them. And principle directs, and of course, circumstances will be different. Context will be different. This is why it's so important to think about things and to be deliberate and to think about what we should do day by day by day. So then when the moment comes that we have to do something, then we have to stand on principle, we have to exercise some courage, then we're ready, we know what to do. And so we do all of this for the sake of what is right and honorable. Courageous people have a devotion to something that they perceive to be right and honorable. Now, one of the things we have to say is that people have disagreements. People see things differently. What one person sees as a principle worth standing on, worth taking a courageous stand on, another person may not consider that to be so important, right? So this is one of the complicating facts of life, that some people will take stands on certain things that other people don't really understand why they're taking a stand on it. And then that person, might be misunderstood. Life is complicated, right? But the question isn't, what do I think, what are the principles other people think I should have? The question is, what principles do I have? What ideals do I have? What commitments do I have? And at what point will I need to stand for them, right? And in doing so, risk some kind of danger to myself, psychological, reputational, perhaps even physical, etc. And one of the interesting things that Aristotle says is that courage is a mark of optimism. If you take a courageous stand for something, that means you believe that there's something worth standing for, right? In other words, there's meaning. There's meaning in life, there's meaning in the universe, there's meaning in action, there's meaning in taking a stand. I think this is what Aristotle means. And I think he means that a courageous stand, if a person takes a courageous stand, then that implies that, we have some confidence that things can change, right? Maybe not now, but in the future, things perhaps can change. And so we look at the example of what's called Tank Man, this man in Beijing, China, who put himself in front of a line of tanks in 1989. These tanks were coming out to put down student protests. These students in China rose up in 1989. They wanted more freedom. They wanted freedom of speech. They wanted freedom of expression. They didn't want to live in a dictatorship anymore. And the students protest, and the government clamps down on them. And as the tanks are coming in, this man here carrying these two bags puts himself in front of the tank. And as the tank tries to go around one way, the man moves in front of it. And eventually he's arrested and taken away. And I don't think we know what's become of him. Well, it looks like a kind of courage. And who knows what motivated, who knows what was motivating this man, who knows what was going through his mind. But it's not hard to think that he's thinking that if he can take this stand, that maybe this will help bring about some kind of change in China. It will help China to become a freer place. In that way, it's an act of courage, certainly, but also an act of optimism. When these young men get off their boats in June of 1944 and invade France with the purpose of pushing Nazi Germany out of France, all right? Well, this takes a degree of courage, all right, to run into machine gun fire, to risk stepping on mines, to have the artillery shells coming in on you, to persist, to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, to not dodge the fight. This takes a degree of courage, but there's a kind of optimism that the evil that the Nazi regime represents can be overcome. The evil the Nazi regime represents can be overcome. There's that sense of optimism that I think Aristotle's getting at. A very different case, this runner I learned about, Justin Gallegos, and Justin Gallegos has cerebral palsy. Right? And it takes a kind of courage to be on a track team when you have cerebral palsy, because you're not going to win races. In fact, you're going to come in last place every time. Every time you're going to come in last place simply because the physical disability makes it impossible for you to run quickly. It takes a kind of courage, I think, to get out on that track and to do it again and again. It takes a kind of courage to have this disability and to run a half marathon and then to run a marathon, right? But there's a kind of optimism there. The optimism that what motivates the desire to show the world that folks with cerebral palsy, with other developmental or with other disabilities, that they can still accomplish things. They can still accomplish important things. So there's something courageous there. There's something inspiring there. There's something optimistic there. I think this is what Aristotle's getting at. Okay, so we look at the quote again. The courageous person will fear what is natural to fear, but will face it in the right way and as a principle directs, for the sake of what is right and honorable, right? So we're talking about something that normal people, can do, right? Normal people can be courageous. We're not talking about Superman, Superwoman. We're talking about courage in the normal course of life. And life brings things that elicit fear, right? And so it's not that the courageous person doesn't feel that, but the courageous person moves ahead despite that. And the courageous person faces whatever challenge is in front of him or her in the right way. This person has thought about things, has deliberated, has thought about how to act, in what way to act. And there's a guiding principle. There's a commitment. There's an ideal. There's some important thing at work that guides me as I move into this situation where I have to take some courageous stand. And I'm acting for the sake of what is right and honorable. A courageous person doesn't act to bring attention to him or herself. A courageous person doesn't act to become a celebrity. A courageous person is acting for the sake of something that's right, for the sake of something that's honorable, for the sake of a principle, for the sake of an ideal, for the sake of something worth standing on, recognizing all the while that people have different views. And so what one person takes a strong stand on, another person may not think is so significant. That's just part of the complexity of life. But the question isn't, what does that person think my principle should be? The question is, what principles do I have? And on what will I stand? Why do I have these principles? These are really, really important questions. And so I want to pitch them to you. What is worth being courageous for? For what would you be willing to show bravery, valor, or boldness? What is worth standing for, even if it seems like no one else is willing to? Now, I think if these questions are being pitched to someone who's 13, 14, 15, they may not quite seem relevant yet. Perhaps, it's kind of unlikely a person who's so young will have had an opportunity to really show courage, right? At the same time, if we're talking about a person who's 40, 50, 60, and that person can't really ever remember a time when he or she needed to show some courage, then that's also strange. Because life presents us with challenges and life presents us with difficulties. And this is why it's so important. This is a point that Aristotle makes in his book. This is why it's so important from earliest childhood to have these kinds of conversations, to help us get ready, to think about life, to reflect on life, to discern what's really important and what isn't, and then to practice, something that maybe doesn't require courage, but it requires some discipline or something like that. But these kinds of conversations are really, really important. So you wouldn't want to say, well, I'm 13, 14, 15, and what does this really have to do with me? Well, it has a lot to do with you, because you're not going to be 13, 14, 15 for very long. You're going to move on into life, right? And things will come at you. And as we work our way through life, we don't want to be like the poor cowardly lion who says, well, what do other people have that I don't have? And someone responds, or our own mind, our own conscience responds and says, courage. No, we want to be people of courage. And so that means that it's something worth thinking about now. These are really good questions. What is worth being courageous for?